Thank you, Dr. Kumar. First of all, I'd like to thank Sam, Ella, and the board of this organization for having me here and having this wonderful conference. You know, I've been coming to Australia for over 15 years. I know that the verbiage in your laws can make it scary to even organize this. I'm sure you covered that, but you know, it took a little guts to start. Every year I come, I hope we're not, going to be leaving, in handcuffs. And equally so, all the wonderful people here. I've just standing around the break room all day yesterday. Everybody has a story. This is not just, people want to have babies. There's actual human suffering going on here, and my heart goes out to everybody. And I think you're also equally brave and commended to come out. And I hope that all of us can help you in some way. So in that vein of human suffering, part of what's been added to our field, PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, also allows us as reproductive endocrinologists to lessen human suffering through genetic diseases. So it's an exciting part of our field because it has even raised the level of what we do. Another interesting aspect of PGD and third-party parenting is that patients teach you things. So some of the issues that were relevant to PGD when it first started have evolved somewhat through the patient's request for it, which I'll explain as we go. What do I push?
This one? I think it's the one about the arrow button. Yeah. This arrow right here.
Okay, good. Makes sense. Oh, the forward button. Okay. So obviously, yesterday, if you were here, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Kettle, did take a little wind out of my sails, but in discussing some of the issues, but they're so important that they deserve a review, and I'd like to talk a little bit from the perspective of the actual science of PGD and how it evolved, and then bring it to where it is relevant to you today. So there are basically four types or four reasons that PGD are done. The first and most popular is called aneuploidy screening. Aneuploidy screening is looking for abnormal chromosomes. Translocations are when a woman or a man is born with the normal amount of genetic material, but a bit of one chromosome got torn off and stuck onto another chromosome. So that person has all the genetic material, but when they divide up their chromosomes to make eggs or sperm, there's a high rate of abnormalities in those gametes and a high chance for abnormalities in the embryo, resulting in either multiple miscarriages or totally intractable infertility, or even more tragic, a baby born with a chromosomal abnormality when one kind of sneaks through with the right arrangement. So these can be diagnosed with PGD now, and women with previous, in most cases, women with previous miscarriages or children affected by aneuploidy can safely have a baby in most cases, not always. Single gene disorders, these apply to genetic conditions like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, Tay-Sachs. And now with the miracle of just incredible expanded and affordable genetic screening, it is possible to find the rare couple that shares a gene, no family history, or if there is a family history, and be able to go through the in vitro process to find the embryos that carry the disease and protect them from what are either life-threatening or 100% fatal diseases in some cases. And finally, the controversial area of family balancing. We are allowed to do this in the United States, so we try to restrict our practice to patients who have children of the opposite gender, but using the aneuploidy screening, the same exact technology, we can sort out which embryos are pink and which are blue. Real quick, DNA is the material that makes us up. Mitosis is what goes on when cells just replicate themselves, and meiosis is what happens when sperm and eggs are being formed to create the 23 chromosome cell. A blastomere is the cell that we take out of an embryo to test it. A blastocyst, as you all know, is that big old, we keep seeing pictures of it, the big old embryo with that little spot in the middle. That's the actual human, and the outer rim called the trophoectoderm, which will become the placenta. Mosaicism, Dr. Kettle mentioned this yesterday, is when there are actually two cells with different chromosome numbers in the same embryo. That adds to the error rate in an early embryo that exists, and we believe that through the magic of nature, most of those embryos sequester the abnormal cells and create a normal baby in most cases. Some people believe that even when children are born with chromosomal abnormalities, they're actually mosaics, that if they were pure Down syndrome, they wouldn't live, that there are some cells in their body that are normal. That's what people believe. That's what DNA looks like. It's that double-stranded molecule, and then, of course, as the cells prepare for fertilization and come together, those strands break up and reform each other to keep copying themselves, and that's where little errors can occur, mutations occur. One of those red balls becomes a green ball, you get a mutation. And that's just a real quick picturesque view of those, how the chromosomes divide up, and you can see if a little bit falls onto the other bit, you get a translocation. That's in the old days, as Dr. Kettle mentioned, we did day 3 biopsies and took one of those cells out. That's a beautiful 8-cell day 3 embryo. You can see that probably was a little destructive. In our hands, we've been doing it from quite early on, literally the beginning, as they are, they used to say, at the beginning of the century. So you're taking out 15% of the embryo. So it probably was a little damaging, and we would sometimes be puzzled by why normal embryos wouldn't make it to blastocyst, and that's probably a contributing factor. You can also understand that if there's mosaicism, all it takes is one cell to be abnormal, and you pick up the wrong cell, and you've got the wrong diagnosis. That's less likely with a blastocyst because there's hundreds of cells, and we get more than one cell out of the embryo. And that's just a picture of how they suck that little cell out of there. So the old technology that we started with in the beginning of the century was fish, the fluorescent in situ hybridization. They created little colored stains that would find unique areas on each chromosome, and the color correlated with that chromosome. You then laid out the cell on a slide, and they would dye it with these dyes, and then look under a fluorescent microscope for the color. It was clever. It actually got us going. It wasn't useless. As we heard yesterday, it didn't really improve pregnancy rates because what we now find when we do PGD, all those wacky chromosomes that they don't test, they're abnormal in embryos. They don't implant. They don't. If they do, they will miscarry. They almost never create a baby, but they do add to the problems of reproduction, and those chromosomes are missed when you're only looking at 5 or 9 chromosomes. You can also see that the errors that would be caused by the physicality of it, if that green dot lands on another green dot, is going to look normal or abnormal. You're not going to get the right count. So this is a trisomy 21 embryo, Down syndrome. You can see the 3 green dots, and that's how they did it. As I said, it got us going, but at this point, the fish is dead. We've seen this picture 20 times. The outer rim of the embryo is the trophoblast, trophoectoderm, and we can take several cells out and get a lot of DNA, and if we time the embryo biopsy correctly, we get an optimal amount of DNA. That's why some programs prefer frozen embryos for PGD, because they can actually biopsy the embryos at day 5 or day 6, get the optimal amount of DNA, freeze the embryos right then, and then they run the test about a week later. You get your results. You know what's in the freezer, and you get your optimal number of cells and the maximum number of embryos biopsied. When we do a fresh cycle, we're kind of under pressure on day 5 to biopsy them and get them out to the lab so we can have the results by the next day. So we understand the pragmatics of it. You're coming all the way from Australia, you kind of want a fresh transfer. You don't want to go back because they'll see you next week. So we have to balance between both, and we fortunately have the capability of doing both fresh and frozen PGD cycles. And that's what it looks like. So you can see on this side, the embryo is being held, and opposite from where the embryo is, the inner cell mass, a wee bit of the trophoectoderm is being gently suctioned off from the embryo. This is, we believe, less traumatic to the embryo. It's already a blastocyst, so obviously it's hard to know what happens afterwards, unless we get a pregnancy. But it is our opinion that we're probably not damaging these embryos very much. So, as I said, it's come a long way very quickly. There are different ways to do the aneuploidy screening now. There are two basic technologies. There's CGH, comparative genomic hybridization. That's pretty much what most people are doing. It does use a colorimetric test like I showed you, but it's more exact. And there are these arrays that can allow us to do 23 chromosomes. The computer analyzes the color, and one color tells you there's 2 chromosomes, the other color tells you there's 3 chromosomes, and so forth. SNP analysis comes from a company called Natera, located in Northern California. It's a terrific technology. We love the company. But it's a little cumbersome because it requires blood from the egg provider and the sperm provider, because they use your DNA to create the probes to actually look at the chromosomes. So it's pretty cool. It'll actually tell you who's contributed the abnormal chromosomes. So sometimes we get the women sitting there saying, see, it's yours, it's not mine, it's yours, the problem. So it's cool. The problem is because they're in Northern California and now it's blastocyst biopsies, they can pretty much only do frozen transfers. So it's fine, but as I said, for some people coming over from Australia and elsewhere, it may be impractical. But these are the terminology that's out there that you might hear about. So it's SNP or CGH. And it's kind of a complicated thing, but it shows you how they create these colors, and and then these arrays look at them more precisely than under a microscope, and then the color that it sees for each area tells it if there's 0 chromosomes, 1 chromosome, or 2 chromosomes. I just wanted to show you this slide to point out that. So is there a pointer on this? Just a pointer. So this came from the early days of that company called Natera. It used to be called GSN, Gene Security Network. That's what the GSN is. And the main point of this slide is to show you that if you are transferring normal embryos, the implantation rate starts to equalize itself over age. And this was really the concrete evidence we needed to show that the main, an important contributing factor to IVF failure was the aneuploidy of the embryos. That's what explained the previous slide you saw, that decreasing pregnancy rate with age. The majority of the embryos at 40 are abnormal. But if you can call out that normal embryo from a woman over 35, the pregnancy rates are approximately the same as women under 35. So in the old line of figures don't lie, but liars figure, remember this is per embryo transfer. So what you're missing in the number are all the women who didn't get a normal embryo. So still the pregnancy rates per egg retrieval are going to be lower for women over 35. But if they get that normal embryo, they are approximately the same as women under 35, thus showing the very important aspect of or contribution of aneuploidy to IVF failures, and why we in the past tended to put more embryos back, and why it made sense. But the randomness of life led us to triplets and quadruplets on occasion when we thought, oh no, they're never going to all take. One of my colleagues in California, in Newport Beach, submitted this data to a meeting a few years ago, showing, as Dr. Kettle also showed yesterday, that using aneuploidy screening can effectively give very good pregnancy rates with a elective single embryo transfer. The key word is elective. And so, as I'll go back to in a minute, and it was clear yesterday as well, there's a difference between all you have is one embryo and an elective single embryo. So if you're selecting the best embryo out of a group, either by its morphology, its appearance, or even better through PGD, and now there are even embryoscopes that allow you to pick embryos based on some computerized models of how the embryo is growing, you're going to have a higher success rate with single embryo than the woman who only made one embryo. And that's an important realization that came about several years ago. And you can see, and these are rather idealized numbers. There's a lot of gender selection going on in that practice. So these are fertile women coming in and picking out an embryo by gender and putting in the single embryo. So they're idealized and kind of almost unrealistic success rates. But you still get the point that they are they're fantastic and decrease the need for 2 embryo transfers. This is our our results from last year in our Encino unit, and again, a lot of egg donors and idealized situations in here, but the success rates using PGD, we believe the current third generation PGD do help contribute to high success rates with low embryo numbers. Not all of our colleagues restrict themselves to single embryo, so there's a lot of double embryo transfers in these numbers. Our own results here, again, they're not huge, showing that slight diminution in success rates with single embryo transfers, but nothing to lose sleep over. Again, corroborating what we saw yesterday, that if you're doing PGD, you ought to be doing single embryo transfers. These are just our general results with and without PGD. They emulate what most people around the world have, very good success rates, particularly egg donor and surrogates, where everything is ideal. A lot of people coming over, we've been talking about this a lot over the last few days, and it's becoming a more increasingly important discussion, fresh versus frozen. So these are our results from Encino. And as you can see, so this exemplifies what I said before, and these are the fresh cycles. 131 women didn't get a transfer. So they either had no normal embryos or they were doing family balancing and sadly didn't have the embryo of the gender of desire, so there was no transfer. So when you again cut out that denominator a bit, there's a rather high 66% pregnancy rate per transfer in that group. These are fresh, again, not all single embryo transfers. In the frozen group, that number is probably not statistically significant. 58%, no one would cry about a 58% pregnancy rate. So the message is, if it's convenient, if you're going through surrogacy in the United States, and if there's an egg donor involved, for instance, or if it's your eggs and you don't have a surrogate yet, even with the fantastic agencies we work with, it takes them 6 to 8 months to go through that process. You hear about all the psych screening and the legal clearance and the medical clearance. It takes a while to gear up for that. And if it's convenient and you're over the United States, you don't have to fear freezing your embryos based on these results. It makes it a lot easier to do the cycle when those embryos are frozen. And again, our single embryo transfer, I'm the king of single embryo transfers in our practice. Again, for a little different than we cited, for some reason that number is a wee bit lower, but again, not one that should scare people. I'm not sure why it's a little bit lower, but it's not in a range that would be fearful. So even I would argue, if it takes one extra transfer to get the pregnancy, it's far cheaper. Even in your situation coming over and all that with the surrogate, than having twins. From all the costs that we saw yesterday.
5 minutes, Dr. Feinman.
I'm at the 5-minute mark. Okay, so I just want to make my pitch for how PGD then is involved in third-party parenting. For women over 35, that's kind of the group that it was targeting, aneuploidy screening. The rate of Down syndrome starts to increase gradually, not scarily, but gradually. After age 35. So weeding out the abnormal embryos probably will help the success rate per embryo and expedite the pregnancy for women over 35. What I've learned, so the group that PGD aneuploidy screening was not intended for were egg donors, and we are inundated with requests by our patients to do PGD on egg donors. So I talk my guts out and try and explain what the whole situation is, and they keep wanting it. And so what we've learned from that, what I've learned from that, is, as we also heard yesterday, that the biggest benefit to PGD screening in an egg donor is the selection of the single embryo for transfer with an excellent success rate and not wasting your time on abnormal embryos in the freezer. So here is the bottom line. I can't remember, Dr. Kell and I talked at coffee, we both can't remember a Down syndrome baby coming from an egg donor cycle. So if you are worried about the health of your children that are born through surrogacy, you are going to decrease the morbidity, the chance for lifelong disabilities and so forth more by doing a single embryo transfer than you get by eliminating the risk of Down syndrome. And what I tell my people, and people don't like hearing it, but this is what I tell them. If you're going to do PGD and put in 2 embryos, don't do the PGD. The risk of Down syndrome is so low in an egg donor population that you are not getting your money's worth, in a sense, from the PGD. Of course, we don't refuse people, but this is what I strongly encourage them to think about. And finally, you don't have to do PGD to do single embryo transfers. There's the oodles of data from the world that in an idealized situation, egg donor in particular, if you just do the single embryo transfer based on morphology alone, you're going to get pretty good success rates. Again, you may be at it a little longer because some of those embryos are going to be abnormal. We're freezing embryos that are abnormal. But I don't want anybody to feel like you're compelled to do PGD if you're under 35 or have an egg donor. It is just a nice touch to make it more efficient and give you some information as to why it is or is not working and keep you from doing wasted frozen transfers on abnormal embryos. But I don't want anybody to come away thinking you got to do PGD to do single embryo transfer, but it is a useful tool. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Maybe we have time for questions or two, and then maybe you can take questions.
Uh-oh. I'm in trouble.
I know PGD can do testing for a lot of problems and genetic faults, but what things can PGD not predict in a pregnancy?
Thank you. Well, the question is asked about 5 out of 4 times is does it prevent autism? And it does not. So autism is not, there are genetic factors to autism, but no one has yet been able to find a single genetic cause of autism. And so that's a frequently asked question, and unfortunately autism is not on it. So it also is not yet really, well actually it can find dominant traits like neurofibromatosis and Huntington's disease, but it's pretty complicated testing. You really have to have family history. So it won't find things that are not single gene disorders, diabetes, heart disease, bipolar disease. These are diseases that have family tendencies, but not single gene causes. So unless there's a single gene cause, it won't find those diseases. Eye color and all that stuff, it's theoretically possible because eye color is a single gene, but no one has really tried to really create the probes and do it. We don't want this to look like vanity. We want it to look like medicine. Preventing disease is the highest calling in medicine. So if we can use reproductive medicine to prevent disease, we're being doctors. If we're doing it to create blue-eyed babies, we're being fools. So that it's theoretically possible at the moment not being offered. It may get there, but I hope not.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you. So if you're looking at an egg donor in the age range of 20 to 30, but having been through a journey already and with all of the different tolls that play on that journey, are you causing more damage to that embryo by doing PGD, or are you going to give yourself more guarantee?
Yeah, we believe that with day 5 transfer, I think my colleagues here would agree, day 5 transfer probably not damaging the embryos. They survive a good test of that is how well they survive the freezing, and they have really respectable pregnancy rates with frozen transfers. So I would say we're not damaging it. I'm saying if it's used for the proper reason, it's a good tool. I would just urge people not to use it because they think they're going to. The common statement from women with egg donation is, I've been through so much, and they have. You guys have been through the most, and by this time I want to do everything I can to make sure I have a healthy baby. Okay, I totally understand that. But the one and only decision you make that affects that, other than your general health, is twins or no twins. So that's why we don't think we're damaging it, and if used properly, is probably helping it, but not mandatory.
Okay, thank you.
One last question, guys. I think from
you mentioned neurofibromatosis. My sister had that. She's since passed away. I ended up with a different syndrome because they didn't notice hers in the beginning. I'm not getting PG tested. My eggs, I'm grateful for whatever obviously I've had a disabled sister, I don't, we don't know where it came from. So obviously she mutated herself because my mother didn't have it, and my grandparents.
Right, that happens. There are de novo mutations for every disease. Right?
So I don't need to get PG tested for that, do I? 'Cause I don't have it, so I can't carry it on. She would have carried it on if she carried it.
It depends if it, well, I'll talk to you more in private, but there, just, back to, biology 101, there are recessive traits where both parents have to carry the disease to make the baby. When they carry it together, there's a 25% chance of it. Tay-Sachs, sickle cell, cystic fibrosis are well-known examples of this. There are uncommon diseases that are dominant. In that case, only one gene is required, and so these are often where there are family histories, but any gene can mutate. So you can theoretically get a de novo mutation of a recessive or dominant trait, and it would depend on what type of trait it is to answer your question better. Also, I'll talk to you later. But that's the idea. Generally, dominant traits, there are family histories because you need one gene. So they're well-known diseases. That honey disease was the one of the Arlo-Guthrie's disease. That's a famous one. They're usually family histories. The recessive traits, usually there are no family histories unless there's been a baby born with the disease. But that's what we're trying to prevent. You're walking in the door, two people randomly, find each other in life, and they could be carrying a recessive trait because they've never had a matchup in their family with another person. Yeah, well, the ones that carry it through relations are recessive traits. Thank you.